I was born to James and Margaret Pierce on March 11, 1848. My name is Matilda J. Pierce, but most people called me Tillie. I lived in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, with my brothers James and William and my sister Margaret. When I was 15 years old, I attended the Young Ladies' Seminary in the summer. One Friday afternoon in June, we heard a cry, "The rebels are coming." Our teacher, Mrs. Eyster, sent us home right away, and I'm sure some of the girls didn't make it home before the rebels were searching the streets. Several days later, on June 30th, the Union passed through town. Then on July 1st, the fighting began. That morning, we heard firing in the direction of Seminary Ridge. It was faint at first, but then it got louder and we heard cannons. Clouds of smoke rose above the ridge. Later that evening, our neighbor, Mrs. Shiver, came and asked if I would accompany her to Jacob Weikert's farm to find refuge from the battle. The Weikert farm was located on the eastern slope of Little Round Top. My parents agreed that I would be safer there, so they allowed me to go. Mrs. Shiver and I made our way to the farm and were gladly welcomed upon our arrival. Soon after, the Union artillery came by and I went to the spring and got some water for the soldiers. I continued this for most of the day until the evening when I went with Becky Weikert into the barn. There were wounded, bloody men crowded into the barn, and I was appalled by the sight. Soon I retired to the house, and this was the end of day one. The next morning, I rose and carried water to the soldiers again. In the afternoon, the cannons were firing back and forth on the round tops behind the house. Some soldiers told us to leave for a farmhouse about a mile away, so we did. However, when we arrived, they told us to go back because it would be safer where we were, where the shells would not be landing. We returned to the farm and helped with the wounded until the closing of the second day. On the third day, soldiers informed us that cannons had been placed on each side of the house because the rebels were attempting to reach Taneytown Road. We fled the house once more and hid at a farmhouse beyond Baltimore Pike. Hours later, the battle began to subside, and when all was quiet, we headed for the house once again. Upon our arrival, we entered the house to see mangled, bloody bodies lined up inside along the walls. The groaning and moaning was so loud that I could hardly think, and it was then that I noticed the amputating benches scattered about the house. I glanced out the south side of the house to see a pile of limbs stacked higher than the fence. It was a ghastly and sickening sight. For a few days after the Union had won the battle, I stayed to help with the wounded. I returned home to my mother a few days later and continued to help in the hospital near my home. In the years after the battle, I watched the Union win the war, the blue and gray shake hands, and finally I watched the men forgive and mourn the terrible tragedy.